Hello and welcome back to Kakiland. In last few episode, we looked at the police crackdown on anti-CA protests that led to the carnage on December 20th, 2019. An apprehension of Muslim uprising ended in 23 deaths, 4,000 arrests, 350 FIR and countless other atrocities. These are detailed in the last few episodes, but there's one more thing that I really want people to acknowledge before moving on. It is the targeting of Muslim children for the protest on that day. So in this episode, we look at the documented state violence against minors in Uttar Pradesh related to December 20th, 2019. This is Kakiland, Stories of Policing Muslims in India.
So on the day of 19th, 20th, 19th again there were detentions, 20th is when there was more violence. What we were hearing was that it was a law and order situation. That is the news. That, people came out and the police stopped them from coming out, and that was about it. But we knew because of Jamia Aligarh and because of news that the nature of the injuries and the violence that was being reported, we knew this couldn't be the entire story. And when we went to visit those places, for instance, we went to Kanpur, a few places that come to mind very much. Kanpur, Mau, Lucknow, all of these, Firozabad, like in all of these places, uh, that is what we found, that people, it wasn't even a proper protest. People had just mobilized, they had just come together, they were moving towards protest sites, and just like in Jamia, where police had barricaded the exit from the locality. From Jamia to the main Mathura road, there was a barricading and people were not allowed to move out of the locality. It was a similar pattern. Just at the edges of the Muslim majority localities, police had done heavy barricading, and the moment they saw the crowd approaching, they started to, in tear gas, lathi charge, and in many places, firing also, live firing also, which is why there were deaths in Kanpur, there were injuries in many places.
Fawaz Shaheen is a human rights activist and researcher who worked on several fact-finding reports in the aftermath of the police violence.
And it didn't end with firing and lathi charge. So, as we were saying earlier, even if the police narrative is true that these were violent or disruptive protests, there is a way of dispersing the protest and then letting it be. But here, the protest wasn't just dispersed, it was attacked. Even when it wasn't a protest, when it was just people coming somewhere in a group, they were attacked, there was violence, and then they were detained. And post detention, there was also torture, and people were beaten up after being detained. So clearly this pattern was very similar to what happened in Jamia and in AMU, where they had decided that we will not let protest happen, and we will not just disperse them, but we will punish them for coming out and for protesting against this.
A report that Shaheen worked on documented 41 minors endured custodial torture, and it didn't just happen in one city.
So the first report that minors have been detained came from Muzaffarnagar. That I remember very clearly. There was a madrasa in Muzaffarnagar, where just like in AMU and Jamia, it was a very small madrasa, 50-60 students, and it was, just after Friday prayers, there was a mosque inside the campus. People had come for Friday prayers. In the masjid, the imam had actually said, please don't participate in this protest, please don't go here from here to any protest, because the imam had an apprehension that police might come in, and that is exactly what happened. After Friday prayers, 2-3 hours later, the police had already barricaded the whole area. Very clearly nobody had come out from the madrasa, but around 3:30 p.m. the police entered the madrasa. The first thing they did was they went to the principal's office, beat up the principal, trashed his whole office. Like, they even broke the ceiling fans and all, which, like, there is no policing logic for breaking fans and coolers. But they did that. And then they went into the hostels. There were 50 students or so in the hostel. Among them, a lot of them were above 18, but there were at least a dozen students who were minors. More, but I mean, I'm saying at least there were many more minors, but we could at least, there were, the news that came out was that at least 12 or 14 of them were minors. And they, they beat up all of them, brought them out, brought everybody out into the ground, where they proceeded to actually humiliate the principal, who was also the imam. Like, they made him squat. They uh, one of the officers got hold of his ears, like, he's some erring child, and they started saying very humiliating things and demeaning him. From there, they detained them, took them to police station. And that is where a lot of, this was the more senseless violence of the UP police, where there was, these people were not even in any protest. Even if they were, it wouldn't be a crime, but they were not in any protest. They were picked up from their madarsa. They were brought to the police station. They were beaten. The imam's hand was fractured. One of the students, who was a minor, he was beaten. His leg was fractured. There was, I think, they had his family had to spend about 1.2 or 1.5 lakh rupees for surgeries after that. There were such severe beatings. But so that was the first news which came out. Of course, not in so much detail. That detail emerged in subsequent fact findings. But initially, Muzaffarnagar was the news that came out. Then we found out that in Bijnor there are about 22 minors who are detained. In Muzaffarnagar, the number was 14. In Bijnor, it was 22. Firozabad, 5. Among the people who were detained, at least 5 minors were there. And later on, so the report that we did looked at these 3 cities, and we counted 41 minors who were detained, who were tortured. And tortured in the sense, when they were initially brought to the police station, they were beaten. They were not only beaten, but they were beaten along with very racialized slurs. They were beaten along with, insults to their Muslim identity, sometimes insults to the Prophet, to provoke them, and or as an expression of hatred. I don't know. Then throughout the night in Bijnor, especially, many of them said that they were denied sleep. Like, if anyone would fall asleep, they would get beaten. If anybody asked for water, they would be slapped. Going to the toilet was a problem. And every time they would ask for something, they would be told to chant Jai Shri Ram. They would be told to first say Jai Shri Ram, then they would get water, then they would get anything. In Muzaffarnagar, the madarsa students, customarily they would fast on Friday, and since that was a Friday, they were fasting. So when they asked for water to break their fast, they were again beaten and asked to chant Jai Shri Ram before they were given any water. So this was a recurring pattern that we found everywhere. Then after we came out with the report, we got information that in Sambhal also same thing has happened. So then we went to Sambhal. 8 minors from different places at least were detained, and they were taken to the jail, not to the police station. And in the jail, the other prisoners beat them up, not the police. So that was another form of torture which we found. Unfortunately, in Sambhal, when we reached, it was in February, and this had happened in December. So by that time, they had been detained for more than a month or so, many of them. And before they were released, whatever lawyer they had gotten had made them sign an affidavit saying that we are all above 18 years of age. And according to them, the lawyer said that this is the only way you will be released. So clearly the police knew that they are doing something illegal, and they were covering their tracks. In Bijnor also, some parents reported, we couldn't speak to all the parents, but the parents we spoke to said that they were made to sign affidavits that their children have not received any ill treatment, and only then they were given, their children were released. That happened within 1 or 2 days. But in all these cases, the police was very aware that it is doing some violations.
Now, India has very strict laws when it comes to dealing with children in conflict of law. But all of those procedures and the legal security a minor has were overlooked during this crackdown.
See, the law on this in India is very, very clear, very transparent. Within 24 hours, you have to be presented before a magistrate. That is a protection. It's supposed to be a protection that the police know how to get around it. So the requirement to produce before a magistrate is something that they managed to fulfill formally. So in all of these cases, what they managed to do was, it's something they do in many cases, they'll produce them before some magistrate and get a detention, get a police custody for 14 days, for 1 month, something like that. So in all of these cases they did that. The unfortunate thing is, the magistrate's role here is to look at not just the case but also the individuals who has been arrested, why, to inquire into reasons. And one very important part of the job is to see whether these people are eligible for arrest, to do the basic checking of whether these are minors or adults, or because if they are juveniles, you can't really put them in jails with adults. I mean, you can't. There is clear law that juveniles can only be put in specified juvenile detention centers, and there is there are procedures which have to happen. For instance, there are juvenile boards which have to be constituted, which have to review these cases, and the entire legal framework for dealing with juveniles is separate. So the UP police clearly, of course they knew this, and if they had produced them as juveniles, they would have had to initiate a whole different procedure, which is why they produced them as adults. And when they were finally releasing them, they, in many places they took these affidavits, in many places they took undertakings from the parents that they will not follow any legal action. Those undertakings are completely invalid, but as an exercise, if you're making people sign it, you are intimidating them. Essentially, you are saying you can't exercise your legal rights. And then in that situation of criminalization of violence, it's very hard to actually approach the courts, to go against the police, to go for legal relief. So most of the people were just relieved that they are getting their children back. There were clear violations of the Juvenile Justice Act, of UN Convention on Protection of Rights of the Child, of many basic legal procedures, and there was torture. So torture in itself becomes illegal, whoever it happens against. But in all of these cases, the police knew that they have state sanction, and why they knew is because it wasn't just the police doing it at a local level. Right about the time when this was happening, the National Commission for Protection of the Rights of the Child, NCPCR, so National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, which was supposed to be the body that protects children, wrote a letter to the DGP of the Director General of Police in UP saying they must take legal action against anyone who uses children as shields during protest. It didn't say anything about protecting children. It didn't say anything about using, excessive use of force. It said you must take action against people who are bringing children to protests. Similarly, you had the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, very clearly saying that we will take revenge. जो लोगों ने प्रोटेस्ट किया है हम बदला लेंगे और हम उनकी संपत्ति, like we will go after their properties. So there was this overall narrative of revenge against protesters, of criminalizing protest, under which the UP police was doing this, which also got reflected in the fact that in Bijnor at least, but in other places also, but in Bijnor very clearly, the children said the police were beating them and telling them that you should never go to a protest again. You must promise you will never go to a protest again. So they were being taught a lesson. The point wasn't that 49 minors were picked up and violated. That in itself is a huge violation. But the intent was beyond that. The intent was to criminalize protest itself, to create a chilling effect where we have picked up your children and we have beaten them up, and this is what will happen if you protest. That was the signaling that they were doing. Most of them were 15-16 year old. Some of them, like there were at least 2-3 children in Bijnor who were 12 years old, like very, very young. But the biggest number of them were 15-16, right about the age when the police clearly considered that if you are old enough to protest, you are old enough to be beaten up. So they didn't really look at what age they were, but the vast majority of them were around 10th standard, or if in madrasa, they were around that age where you are doing almiyat, I think, where you're around that 10th standard age. So it's hard to gauge, because at that point, I think the dominant emotion was shock. uh, a lot of them had gone to protest, and there is no problem in students going to protest. uh, Many of them were not even in the protest, they were just in their in their school or in their madrasa, in their boarding institution. But whether they had gone to protest or not, the the dominant emotion was shock, and a very clear sense that, like, uniformly everybody said that we were targeted because we were Muslim, even when we didn't ask any question like that. They said it because that is how clear it was. So of course, at that point there was no space to dwell on what they're. We were very acutely cognizant that these are children who have faced trauma and they need it. In our report also we tried to highlight it, but unfortunately there were so many things happening that at that point there was no time to deal with the effect that it would have had on their mental health. But they were going through, like, there were some who were very badly injured, who were saying that, like, I don't want to step out of my house again. There were sentiments like that also. There were some who were saying, no, I mean, this happened and now we'll forget it. There's always a range of reactions. Some people try to forget it, some people go into it, but the shock and the sense of hurt that they were targeted because they were beaten this bad because they were Muslims, that was very palpable. And some people were more angry, some were more disappointed, dejected. That whole spectrum is there. But I do regret the fact that we couldn't spend any time, any effort into looking at how this affected their mental health, how it would affect their lives going forward, and that whole trail was lost. The violence during the protest was very clearly targeted, and I wouldn't hesitate to say it was racialized violence. It was violence against a community that was identified by the police as a problem. And a lot of people say that this was a protest that happened only in the ghetto, and it was only in Muslim localities it was happening. They never bothered to ask why it was why these Shaheen Bagh and these protest sites were set up in Muslim areas. It's because the police circumscribed those limits. The people who were protesting didn't want to protest in Shaheen Bagh. They wanted to protest in front of Parliament. They wanted to protest in the city center. But the police violence that took place bound them in a certain limit. It said that you can't move out of your locality. You will be contained in the ghetto. So the people from other communities who joined in the protest, that was an act of solidarity, trying to communicate that this is not just a Muslim issue. So that was very crucial, that was very important. But the police action is what made it into a protest that happened inside Muslim localities. That is not an accident. That is a symptom of the fact that the moment people tried to step out, people tried to come into the, people tried to articulate as anything else, within the community, people might have had different opinions, different ideologies. Some may have been, protesting from the position of citizens. Some may have been protesting purely as people have different approaches, different identities. The police violence reduced it all to just one identity. These are all Muslims, they are protesting, and this is not correct. And of course, this signaling again came from the very top when the Prime Minister said that you can recognize the protesters from their clothes. That is where the signal was sent out. It was very loud and clear. So the violence that happened, it was extremely targeted, and that it's not even a disputable fact that the way protesters on 19 December itself, if you see that the detentions that happened in Delhi, where massive action had happened, all, civil society in a true sense had come out to protest. The detention was, of course, it was very severe, it was very clinical, but the police were careful not to orchestrate a lot of violence. But the same detentions that happened in Muslim localities in Muzaffarnagar, Firozabad, Lucknow, Mau, there the police was gloves off. There the police had no restraint. The detention didn't follow any. Like the people who were detained in Delhi on the 19th in the morning were released by evening. Some of them were released the next day before 24 hours. And it wasn't just a thing of Delhi police and UP police. In UP, the police clearly chose Muslim look. I mean, the same protest could also have been dispersed when it came into the city center. But the police were careful to attack the protesters before they came out of Muslim localities. Because they were not just attacking protesters, they were also criminalizing certain geographies. They were saying that these localities, these communities are disruptive, they are the problem, and that is why we are doing police action there. In the popular media, popular press, that also, and popular imagination also, I'm guessing, that also helped to justify the violence. Because anyway, Muslim localities are marked out as criminalized areas by the police. That is the general narrative. Many people, I mean, there has been so much research on this, that Muslim localities are painted as criminalized locations by the police. That is a narrative which is created. And all of that helped to justify this kind of violence. So I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the violence happened in Muslim localities and then the protests were also limited to the Muslim localities. I think these are intrinsically connected.
2 years after the violence, I met the family of Muhammad Sagir, the 8-year-old boy who was killed in the stampede in Varanasi. Although police was not directly involved, his family alleges that the police action, which includes blocking the road and lathi charging the people who were coming out of the mosque, led to the death. As we have already mentioned in the last episode, and here we are going to mention it again, none of the people who were attacked or targeted on December 20th, 2019 in Uttar Pradesh were given any justice. In fact, the only relief that happened was Allahabad High Court stopped the police from attaching properties of the accused as recovery for the damages caused during the protest or the violence that came after it. It is a reality that not even Muslims have registered what happened on December 20th, 2019 as a major violence against the Muslim identity in India. 5 years later, there are many more examples of such police action in Uttar Pradesh. Recently, in Sambal, 5 Muslims were killed in police firing when a protest against surveying a historic mosque turned violent. Thank you for listening. Come back for the new episodes.